We'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is our keynote speaker. It is Dr. Leonard E. Ajedi, and he is a director of the Center for Advancing Population Science, professor of medicine and eminent scholar, chief of the Division of General Internal Medicine, and associate director of Diversity and Genomic Sciences and Precision Medical Center. He is also the co-director of the MCW CTSI KL2 program, and he's also the director of the Masters in Clinical Translational Research, also at the CTSI. He is a general internist and health services researcher. He's tenured professor of medicine, an eminent scholar, and chief of the Division of General Medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He's also director of the Center for Advancing Population Science. He's a recognized health disparity researcher, and he is focused on developing and testing innovative interventions to reduce or eliminate health disparities related to race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and geographical location for chronic medical and mental health conditions. His career started with diabetes as a template, but he has since worked with other physical and mental illnesses. He's published over 300 manuscripts, and his work has led to recognition that disparities exist and has moved the field towards focusing on what can be done to address those inequities. So, Dr. Ajedi, with no further ado, please take it from here. You'll be talking to us about structural racism and health, the conceptual framework, strategies, and recommended actions. Dr. Ajedi.
All right, thank you all for having me. A pleasure to be here. Actually, just for clarification, my name is pronounced Ajedi. Like
Ajedi.
So for those who are, it's okay. It's a very difficult name. It doesn't sound the way it's spelled. So happy to be here. I'm going to talk about structural racism and health, conceptual frameworks, strategies, and recommended actions. And some of this, I have no conflict of interest to disclose other than my funded grants from NIH funded grants. So I'm going to try to focus on a couple of objectives, which is to discuss definitions, historical basis for structural racism and policies that perpetuate structural racism, discuss pathways and impact of structural racism on health outcomes, and then discuss a conceptual framework for understanding impact of structural racism on health, and then discuss strategies for change. And the strategies for change comes from a New England Journal paper that we published that talked about some of the strategies that we think will really make a difference as we go forward. And so this is kind of my outline. I will just go straight for the sake of time. So starting with definitions and historical origins of structural racism, I think it's really important for us I like to kind of go back and really kind of get us grounded in terms of what is structural racism. There are two broad definitions that are used. One of them is totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing inequitable systems that in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and distribution of resources. And the other is the organized systems within societies that cause avoidable and unfair inequalities in power, resources, capacities, and opportunities across groups or ethnic groups. So these are just general two broad definitions. But I always start off by saying that what we're facing today is not brand new. And so this is a quote from anyone who's read Ibram Kendi's book, that Mississippi Senator and future leader of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, gave a speech on the floor of the United States Senate on April 12, 1860, as an objection to a proposed bill that would appropriate funds for Black education in Washington, D.C. And what did he say? He said, this government was not founded by Negroes, nor for Negroes, but by white men and for white men. The inequality of the white and Black races was stamped from the beginning. So I think it's important as we think about this, as we have this conversation, that people understand that these ideas have been around for a while. And so it really helps to understand that process. And so the other ways, so how do we think about racism and racist ideas? So racist ideas can be summarized as any idea that suggests that one racial group is superior or inferior to another group in any way. And these ideas can be categorized into three groups. And this is based on Ibram Kendi's work, which I actually agree with in terms of how he has characterized these groups. So you have segregationist ideas that racial groups are created unequal. You have assimilationist ideas that both discrimination and Black cultural traits and of physical ideals are problematic. What does that mean? That somehow something about you makes you prone to bad outcomes. As a result, we need to do something to help you. And then the third is it's really the anti-racist ideas that all people are equal. The only thing inferior is their opportunities. And this is really a fundamental grounding for the work that we have done over time. And that many of these ideas are, by and large, segregationist ideas are localized to smaller groups, but assimilationist ideas are very, very common in our conversation today, especially in healthcare. So this is a slide that many of you are familiar with. And this slide, I didn't realize this until someone brought it to my attention, that when you look at this slide, it's supposed to show equality and equity. But when you look at equity, what you have there is that it suggests that that individual needs extra help. So by and large, you're essentially saying that this, even though you're trying to achieve equity, someone needs extra help. Instead of arguing, instead of demonstrating that the issue is not they need extra help, they actually need opportunity. You need to level the playing field. So I think this is a slide that people use to show equity, but it's actually the wrong slide because it sends the same message and perpetuates old stereotypes that minorities always need help, as opposed to saying, if you level the playing field, then you actually allow people to compete effectively. And so I'm just going to walk through some policies that perpetuate structural racism as we go through this talk. And it's important to recognize that governmental and institutional participation in discrimination is considered a thing of the past, but it continues through current day policies and laws. And so you can't ignore years and centuries of laws that have kept things in place. Until you reverse those laws, essentially, you continue to perpetuate the issues at stake. So past discrimination also impact current practices through policies, though they do not mention race, but they were developed with racist intent. And the interconnected systems of health, justice, labor, housing, and education compound each other through unfair practices which reinforce other sectors. I'm going to show you how all of these sectors are related and how what we see today in healthcare is not independent of some of these other factors in terms of housing, labor, and justice. So the two concepts that are really important, one is de facto and de jure. De facto is true in fact, but not officially sanctioned, results of private and personal preferences and individual choice, not the result of law or government policy. Whereas de jure is sanctioned by law and public policy. Without government and law, private prejudice has far less opportunity for expression and is not reinforced through judicial decisions and policies based on prior law. So de facto segregation or discrimination doesn't really have as much impact until it becomes de jure, where there are laws in place that keep those discrimination in place, and it makes it difficult for people to actually break away from them. So this is an example of the housing discrimination. And I'm not going to spend too much time here, but these are from 1791, the Bill of Rights, the Fifth Amendment, that prohibited the federal government from treating citizens unfairly. And then the 13th Amendment prohibited slavery and actions that deem to perpetuate the characteristics of slavery. But then the 14th Amendment prohibits states or their local governments from treating people either unfairly or unequally. However, in 1883, the Supreme Court did not agree that exclusion from housing market could be a badge or incident of slavery. As a result, from 1883 to 1965, there was residential segregation was the norm because the Supreme Court allowed it to hold. And so then in 1965, the decision rejected the 1883 implication by upholding that housing discrimination was a residue of slave status. And you can imagine what has happened over that period of time and how these laws and how they were interpreted actually change the intent of what the Fifth and 13th Amendment were designed to do. So when you think about discrimination as being unconstitutional, housing discrimination did not become unconstitutional in 1968 with the passage of the Fair Housing Act. It was actually unconstitutional since 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. But litigation cannot remove the impact of policies which occur in 102 years, because it is important to recognize that these factors, the jure sanctioned by laws and policies, are always required. And you require laws to change to actually break the impact of de jure segregation. So de facto segregation, people can change their minds, but the de jure segregation and discrimination are things that are built into law, and the only way to change them is to actually change laws. And like Richard Rothstein said, let bygones be bygones is not a legitimate approach if we wish to call ourselves a constitutional democracy. So saying forget the past without changing the laws that make the past difficult is not an appropriate approach. So here's an example of housing and segregation. Residential segregation is not the result of a single law, but a series of racially explicit laws, regulations, and government practices. And this is what makes it de jure. So housing associations of the 1900s lobbied city councils to institute zoning restrictions. So what we call restrictive covenants, or what is known as restrictive covenants. And the goal was to restrict ownership of houses to African Americans. And so that the Homeowners Loan Corporation essentially created 4 zones, what they called colored zones. Red was hazardous, yellow was definitely declining, blue was still desirable, and green was best. And the idea was that these housing codes were tied to the proportion of African Americans that were in those neighborhoods, because the more African Americans lived in that environment, the code was more likely to be red or yellow. So by law and by policy, it made it difficult for African Americans to actually own homes in certain neighborhoods. So this is a map of redlining, and this is I use this from Milwaukee, and most cities in the Midwest would have this. Even in the Northeast, they actually have. So these are codes, and these are codes from the 1970s housing code. For those of us who live in Wisconsin and Milwaukee, these codes, the green areas are the affluent areas, the red areas are the poor areas, and so this coding from way back in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s still hold today. And a lot of the inner city areas and the segregation that we see are tied to these housing zones and the restrictive covenants that were in place. Then you go to education. Schools are still highly segregated due to racial segregation of housing. So one area that, especially in the South, that's really unfair is when you say that schools are funded by their tax base. What that means by that action alone, you essentially create a system where you live begin to dictate whether your school system will be decent or not. So if your tax base is low and is poor, then you really cannot get good schools and you have access to good schools. So funds flows that are based on tax structures uphold unequal distribution of educational resources and also human resources. And so those under-resourced schools produce unequal opportunity and options for higher education. And this is what we talk about when we say leveling the playing field. If education opportunities are level, then people can at least have a chance to compete over time. Then let's look at accumulation of wealth. So minorities, first of all, are unable to build wealth through home ownership, and with less opportunity to build wealth through higher education are also impacted by the legacy of employment and retirement laws. So for example, someone did a study where they actually took a house. If someone bought a house in the 1970s, and you paid $100,000 for that house. Now, most of those houses may be worth about $400,000. You pass that on to you've paid all of that mortgage, you pass that on to your kids, and all of a sudden you've actually built wealth for that next generation. Meanwhile, the individual who was not able to buy houses, who bought houses in those red line areas, literally have no asset to pass on to the next generation, and that keeps the cycle going. Then another example is the Social Security Act of 1935 that was to create employment-based old age insurance and unemployment compensation. But there was a deliberate decision to exclude agricultural workers and domestic servants to secure the votes of the Democrats in the South. And these positions were most often held by African Americans, which afforded white recipients opportunities to build wealth and pass this on to their children, while African Americans became dependent on their children after retirement. And then today, white households own almost 86% of the wealth of the US, while African American households own only about 4% and Hispanic households own 3%. So this again shows you how laws that are not intended to be discriminatory over time, until you address them, continue to perpetuate what we see today in terms of accumulation of wealth. So this is an example I use. If you look at the national level, the median income across the US, for example, roughly about 68,000. But you look at it by race. For whites, it's non-Hispanic, about 76,000, African Americans, 45,000, Hispanic, 56,000, and Native Americans, 40,000. So you can see just by wealth, by income level already, you see gaps by race. And these factors, when you adjust for other factors, it's not explained by a lot of the factors that we actually tend to think about. So some of these residual factors continue to perpetuate disparities that we see today. Then the next area I want to touch on is policing. So if you look at from the 1700s, the American law enforcement included slave patrols made up of white volunteers empowered to enforce laws related to slavery. And so by the 1830s, there were centralized municipal police departments that began in the early 19th century. And these folks were overwhelmingly white males and were focused on addressing disorder of dangerous underclass. And that included African Americans, immigrants, and poor. So this process is what we're beginning to see today. So by 1865, there was a need to enforce Black codes dictating how formerly enslaved people could work, how much they could be paid, and where they traveled. And then obviously up until 1960, Jim Crow laws were used to enforce segregation. So the policing has always been tied from the past to slave patrols to predominantly white dominated police force, that now many of those old processes are difficult to actually extricate. And so many of the things we see with the policing is tied to some of these old residual factors. And then the idea of state-sanctioned violence, and which is something that some people have an issue with the idea of, but the idea is that from the 13th Amendment through the 1960s, authorities did not punish perpetrators when African Americans were lynched, nor did the judicial system hold police accountable for stopping African Americans from being murdered by mobs. So from that period of time, there's always been that acceptance or general acceptance that these things were okay if it was a particular group. And now we're talking about changing how the police functions. Meanwhile, these laws that have allowed things to stay the same have not been changed. And so as of October 12, 2020, about 1,000 people have been shot and killed by the police in the past year. The rate at which African Americans are killed by police is twice as high as that for white Americans. And for unarmed individuals, African Americans have almost three times higher odds of being shot by the police. And these numbers are real. These are factual numbers, and we keep talking about trying to change the policing, but we don't pay attention to the underlying laws that have actually allowed these processes to stay in place. Then the next thing I want to talk about is mass incarceration. And when you look at national incarceration rates have tripled between 1970 and 2017. And policies and structural changes that were initiated by the war on drugs led to an increase in nonviolent drug-related crimes. So if you look at the data, illicit drug use is approximately 8% among white Americans and 9.6% among African Americans. Yet African Americans are 16 times more likely to be arrested and convicted for a drug crime. So the rate of use is about the same, roughly about the same, but the rate of incarceration is 16 times compared to that group. And African American and Hispanic men who are unemployed and younger age are more likely to receive a prison sentence compared to whites. And at the height of the incarceration rate in 2008, about 37% of African American men without a high school diploma were incarcerated. This is essentially a whole generation of individuals who are likely to build wealth, cannot build wealth, and once you get incarcerated, when you come out, your chances of getting employment are diminished, educational, you can't get certain federal loans. So as a result, you're essentially left for generations of poverty as a result of incarceration. Now, it doesn't mean that people should not be punished for their crimes, but the issue is how are you actually carrying out those punishments? Is it equitable? Are you actually paying attention to, are the laws in place to actually ensure equitable policies when it comes to some of these factors? And then if you look at the judicial system and sentencing, for example, so minorities are impacted by a combination of unfair police practices, higher risk of state-sanctioned violence, and then higher risk of incarceration. And African Americans are more likely to receive a conviction, harsher sentence compared to whites for the same crime. And compared to white men, African American men who have a prior record are deemed to be recidivist, whereas white men with a prior record will be deemed rehabilitated if provided with community service. So the ability to actually recover after incarceration becomes even different for individuals as they go forward. And then it's really difficult for you to now recover after that whole process. So I'm just going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about ways in which structural racism and its impact on health outcomes. So one of the things that tends to happen is there's always discussion about, is this real? And a meta-analysis of almost 300 studies found that structural racism was significantly associated with poor mental and physical health. And the strongest evidence is for adverse effects on psychological well-being, mental health, and health behaviors. And the largest mean difference was for negative mental health. And and if you look at the effect size, it's kind of moderate. And racism has been strongly associated with high blood pressure, and age, sex, birthplace, and education did not moderate the effect of racism on health. So there is an independent effect of racism on health and health outcomes. And so what are some of the pathways? Well, several pathways have been hypothesized. One of them is social deprivation from reduced access to employment, housing, and education, increased environmental exposures, the issue about what side of the railroad track do you live on, and depending on where you live and where things are dumped, environmental exposures are increased, targeted marketing of unhealthy substances, inadequate access to healthcare, physical injury and psychological trauma from state-sanctioned violence, chronic exposure to discrimination, and diminished participation in healthy behaviors or increased participation in unhealthy behaviors as coping mechanisms. So these are potential pathways that are still being explored. And then I think it's important to understand that chronic stress is really the driver. And we've done some work now in inner city Milwaukee, where we've actually tried to capture the impact of chronic stress. And what you find is that an acute event is usually not as the same as repeated exposure to discriminatory practices over time. And when you get to the point where you've had generations of exposure, then you have this cumulative effect. And it actually leads to the biomarkers of disease, things like allostatic load, telomere length, cortical dysregulation, inflammatory markers that are higher, that are tied to some of this structural racism. So while this is an issue, one of the things I always do at this point of my talk is to make it very clear, because people say, you know, are you saying the country is so bad there's no hope? And I actually believe that there is hope. And I actually believe that, you know, as an immigrant who migrated from Nigeria to the United States, the United States is one of the best countries in the world today. What issue is that you can go from good to great. You know, you can actually move from we don't have to stay the same. We can actually get better. So as we start understanding some of these issues, there's a chance for us to actually do things better. So I am of the mindset that it is not hopeless, that there's a chance as we begin to explore, understand these issues, do the right science, we can actually get to strategies that will actually bring about change. So this is a framework that I actually would like to share that talks about how do we go from racism to what is the process and what are some of the pathways that we need to pay attention to. So if you start from societal ideologies, right, white supremacy, capitalism, meritocracy, then you look at governance. This is a pathway, governance in terms of education, legal system, economy, organizations, hospitals, schools, and communities, and then at the individual level, health, wellness, academic achievements, socioeconomic mobility. And what you have to pay attention to is that at each of these levels, there are activities that need to change for us to be able to achieve equity and address structural racism. So I'm going to just kind of walk through. So if you look at some of the guiding theory for racial equity, these are for those who are in the social sciences, they're very familiar with this. For those in medicine, this is something that's usually new, but it's really important to understand, you know, critical race theory, racialized organizational theory, racial state theory. These are all theories that have been put forward that explain a lot of the racism that we see today. And many of these sociology literature, and many times it doesn't make it into the medical literature. So it's important for us to recognize that people have been doing work in this area now for generations, and some of the knowledge you've actually gained can help and provide insight in how we address racial equity in health and healthcare. So the idea about societal ideologies, I think societal ideologies oppose structural racism that lends to racial health inequality. So for example, the concept that Black Americans are more likely to engage in deviant and health-harming behaviors such as substance use. And this behavior has now been shown to impact, as COVID has come around now, we're beginning to see the assumption that the COVID that we're seeing is something inherently wrong with Black people, as opposed to saying you live in an environment, the structural factors are the things that put you at risk for some of these diseases. And then, so what then happens is that the ideologies actually place blame on the individuals, so whether it's the Black individuals, the indigenous people, whether it's Hispanics, and they ignore the structural factors that create and perpetuate the ideology. And so as we begin to talk about strategies, we need to pay attention to how do we actually move from just the blame approach to actually say, we do have a problem and what do we need to do to address it? Then governance and organizations. So racialized ideologies are materialized through our systems of governance. So example, I just mentioned redlining and restrictive covenants. When you create this kind of governance structures, you create situations where schools, hospitals, and all of those resources are limited based on where people live. So for example, where you actually choose to locate grocery stores, makes a huge difference. The kind of schools you have access to, the housing you have access to, all of those factors are tied to governance and organizations and how things are done. And even in healthcare, when we look at the number of physicians who are minorities, when we look at the number of nurses who are minorities, are we making sure that we're actually creating equitable structure in our healthcare systems as we go forward? Then at the individual level, you have issues with access, housing, educational opportunities, high quality healthcare, security, even political power, and the ability to actually build wealth. All of these factors are all connected and they're actually linked to kind of what we see today. So what are some of the recommended strategies to address this? And this is mostly taken from, like I said, the New England Journal paper we published this past year, looking at the impact of COVID and social determinants. But I want to start off that we have to pay attention to that the idea that we cannot let bygones be bygones and expect to see a change. So the idea that, well, it happened in the past, just accept it, it is what it is not enough. There needs to be an attempt to actually say, how do we undo some of these laws that are actually being carried forward today? And another example is the idea of how we do policing. And, I hear people say things like, oh, we need to get rid of the police. We can't get rid of the police. We need to have an effective police system. The difference is, how do we create a police force that's equitable, that actually does what they're supposed to do and does not discriminate against certain groups? That is a challenge, as opposed to looking for easy answers of just, you get rid of this or you change things. And those radical changes do not really address the core problems that we have. So I think part of some of this conversation is being able to have the difficult conversations, being able to put things on the table and go back and forth until you come up with a solution that actually makes sense. And so until we address the root cause for the health disparities we see around us, the symptoms will continue, and we keep kind of touching on the symptoms. So here are some strategies that we think that would actually address these issues. One is to change policies that keep structural racism in place. We need consistent pressure to effect radical changes in the structure and components of policies. The evidence is needed to guide ongoing revisions of policies, and most of us that do research, we provide evidence. And then we need to then make sure that that evidence is actionable. And then we need large-scale policy interventions and evaluation that incorporate measures of health outcome. And education for students and CMEs for practicing providers should support organizational change and an understanding of how health professions intersect with other sectors. I hear a lot of physicians and trainees who say, well, what do you expect me to do? I can't fix their housing. I can't fix their food. But the fact is, you actually have influence. You can do a lot of things differently. How you make diagnosis, for example, now there's this whole conversation about race-based kidney function and how we actually calculate race-based EGFR. And the question, it never occurred to me that actually, I just took it for granted it was right. And you took medical students who started asking questions about, well, why is this the case? And it's those types of questions that will actually get us to a point where we actually begin to challenge paradigms that may not be based on science, but just based on assumptions that have been carried over from time. Then we need to break down silos and create cross-sector partnerships. There needs to be participation in meaningful systems level work and build relationship across sectors. What I observe is that each sector, the criminal justice system, housing, food, health are all seen as different sectors. But the fact is the individual doesn't really care. At the individual level, the individual is part of a macro environment. And so the housing impacts them, the healthcare impacts them, schools impact them. So we need to find a way to bridge those gaps and start having conversations across sectors. We also need to identify ways to leverage and share infrastructure and financing. Things like multi-sector place-based partnerships that reinvest in neighborhoods, promising opportunity to create change. So we are working now in Milwaukee with some of these place-based initiatives where you actually bring people from 5-6 different sectors, you co-locate them in the same environment, you target 3 to 5 neighborhoods over time, and then over a 5 to 10 year period, you actually bring transformative change. And then that can then lead to policy change, and gradually over time, you can actually bring about change. And then we also should actually expect that funding for pilot projects should require cross-sector partnerships. And there should be a need to identify barriers to sustainable expansion and incorporate health measures. So part of the problem is that people who do a lot of the social justice work do that without paying attention to health outcomes. And then those who do work in health don't pay attention to some of the social factors. And really, there needs to be a melding of those two domains. And just like we need to begin to bring social sciences into medicine, we need to actually begin to bring some of the work in sociology and psychology into medicine so that we actually begin to understand all the different nuances of how things actually play out. Then we need to institute policies to increase economic empowerment. I truly believe that this is the ultimate frontier if we want to see change. When people are empowered economically, they build wealth. When they build wealth, you address generational gaps. And so we need to find ways to bring more jobs to inner city environments. We need to address unfair housing policies and limitations on student loans for formerly incarcerated persons so that they can actually be able to go back and get a job. At the end of the day, handouts are not helpful. They solve a problem short term, but they actually don't create wealth. And the goal is to actually create wealth and give people opportunities to create wealth so that over time they take care of themselves and they're better able to manage themselves. So policies that limit intergenerational economic mobility require structural change. There needs to be an ability to actually say, how do we create an environment where people can actually get jobs, do the kind of work they want to get done, and build wealth for them and their families so that generations do not stay in the same place. And then the next thing is to fund community programs that enhance neighborhood stability. And some of these things are tied to healthy food. So for example, you have, how do we choose to locate grocery stores? How do we actually choose to locate certain opportunities? You drive by certain neighborhoods and you're shocked at how the lack of absence of healthy food options, lack of opportunity for green space. And these are things that can be done at the policy level. How do you actually build neighborhoods? What do you actually put in neighborhoods? What's allowed to thrive in certain environments? And funding community programs that support structural interventions that build resilience and alter the context of health is also something that's important. And then there needs to be an effort by health systems to build trust. We're dealing with that right now with COVID, and we're talking about vaccine hesitancy, and we're surprised that people don't want to take the vaccine. If you know about Tuskegee and you know about all the things that have happened in the past, yeah, it's not a shock that people are saying to themselves, you just wake up one day, you make this new vaccine, and you're telling me to take it. How do I know it's going to help me? Now, we are trying very hard to build trust, but part of our goal is to really pay attention to, are we actually building trust in communities? Are we just studying communities? And many investigators you go to them to draw blood, you want to do genetic studies, you want to do all kinds of studies, but you don't ask the question, what do they really need? How do you get them involved? And so I know many CTSIs now are beginning to talk about community engagement, and we need to really spend more resources and effort in community engagement and building trust in those communities, engaging them in meaningful ways, and leveraging the knowledge of the community in the activities and the things that we actually do. And then we also need to deploy interventions that address social risk. It's no longer enough to just give medications and tell people, take your medications. People are not living, healthcare is just one aspect of their lives. And so the individual spends probably 95% or 99% of their time in that environment and very limited time in the health environment. So we need to find ways to address social risk, food insecurity, housing instability, transportation challenges, employment opportunities. How do we create those kind of programs, and how can healthcare become a partner in those activities in terms of addressing some of these challenges? And then the last thing I want to mention is something that I think is really important, is to move from a deficit model to a strength-based model. Many times when we deal with minorities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, we always treat them as if they have a deficit. There's something wrong with you. There's a fundamental problem that you have. Without asking the question, these individuals have survived for generations. How have they survived? There's something that's intentionally strong about them that we need to leverage. And so rather than this unintentional perpetuation of racist thinking that something is wrong with you. So for example, in many educational programs, we talk about pipeline programs, but the pipeline program is something about you is inferior. So we need to essentially bring you up to speed. As opposed to asking the question, why are the schools, if you actually go to the same schools those individuals go to, you probably will have inferior education. If the individual is not inferior, the educational opportunity is what is inferior. And the idea is to really begin to revise existing programs to create opportunities that level the playing field. And efforts in diversity should be integral in changing existing structures and impact resource allocation. So as we go forward, we need to begin to move away from this mindset of something is wrong with you, we need to fix you, to saying, what do you bring to the table? How do we leverage what you do well? And for example, when we think about community workers now, you can actually use community workers to leverage the strength of the community, as opposed to focus on why the community is flawed and all the challenges with the community. And so I truly believe that the next frontier is moving from a deficit model to a strength-based model, where we actually begin to leverage what is good about the communities, what is good about these individuals, and what can we leverage about them that will actually help them improve health and health outcomes. So I think this is my last slide. In conclusion, without a commitment to tackle structural racism, health disparities will persist. And commitment to sharing our own racist ideas. And it is important to recognize that we all have views. We have been taught that ignorance and hate lead to racist ideas, and this leads to racist policies. But the actual foundation of racism is not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. And as we begin to understand that, and that the idea of a zero-sum game, your gain and my loss. If we actually provide resources, you lose something, that is what is holding us back. And actually, when you look at a lot of the foundational issues, many of those issues were economic. And so as we start thinking about policies, we need to recognize that we need to change some of these foundations and really begin to look at how our self-interest impacting our ability to make decisions. And then we need to commit to action, advocate for equality, and be a voice for the oppressed and the marginalized. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. E. Really appreciate your lecture. It was broad-ranging, and I really think it really addressed a lot of great issues. We have some time for questions, and we have one from Ann McHugh, and this is a comment. Respectfully, I am concerned that the term minorities is a term that perpetuates the deficit model. I don't know if you have a comment about that or a thought.
So that's a very important perspective because I think the terminology now the terminology changes from time to time. Black, indigenous, people of color. The fact of the matter is that the term minority is a term that has been here for a while. It doesn't mean that the current minority will always be a minority. And I think the idea of using minority is actually a social justice mindset. In certain environments, certain groups are a minority. The minority in one environment tends to be marginalized. So it is not whether you are white or black. It's really the term minority essentially says there's a majority group and there's a minority group. And in some environments, the majority group is actually different. And so the idea, while I respect that perspective, I also think it's important to understand the origins of the word majority and minority. And when we use it, we're talking about a power differential, that the majority population tend to have a power differential and they tend to be the ones who are able to make laws, change laws, and the minority is always at a disadvantage. And we need to actually protect the minority. And that's kind of the underlying framework.
Great. There's another comment. Thank you for that explanation. I think we have some lay people on the call as well. I'm not on the Zoom call as well. There is a comment from Myra Martinez, who is one of the participants in the talk, and I couldn't fully understand exactly what she was trying to say, but it appears to me that her concern is that research is innately racist, at least the way it's practiced now. And so it seems like that's kind of, and she quotes that from her lived experience. And her, so I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts about comments like that and how we can work with community members who may have that perspective?
I just want to be sure that I understand the question. Is the question that research is racist, or is the question that that racism does not exist in research?
It's not really a question. It's an attempt to try to address a comment that was made by one of the participants. And I think what it says essentially is not whether racism exists or not, but that personally she's associated research with racism, and she's not sure how all of this plays out. But that's her personal opinion.
Yeah, so I can address that to a certain degree. I think when you read, I was listening to the other talk about the prior presenter. There's a book called Medical Apartheid, that actually chronicles the legacy of research in the United States before a lot of the protections were put in place. And so some of those legacies are things that still challenge our ability to do research today. However, I would say that most research that's being done today, there are measures in place to protect minority groups, to protect marginalized groups, to protect all groups as much as possible. And I think it doesn't mean that research is not perfect. However, we do need research to make policy. And so a lot of the research that we do today, we need to be able to do that research, and we need to be able to involve all groups. And one of the challenges that we face today is that we actually do not have a lot of the Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color are not included in many of the research studies. And so then the results are not generalizable to that population. So it's really important to engage broad groups in research going forward.
I couldn't agree more. Another comment is from Patricia Bass, who is one of our legal team at Boston Medical Center, and she's been on the front line of making sure that the research that occurs at BMC is as equitable as we can. And obviously all places have a long way to go. Anyway, this is her comment. Isn't the real problem that bigotry is so deep-seated that the stigma follows wherever the term we decide to use it? Think Negro, colored, Black African-American. Subsequent renamings of quote-unquote Black people do not change the perception of inherent inferiority. How do we address that underlying problem? Getting sidetracked by terminology is not particularly useful.
I would agree. I couldn't agree more. I think this is really, I really appreciate that comment, because we always keep changing the terminology. So now the new terminology is BIPOC, right? And tomorrow is minority, non-minority. It is not, and terminology is important. It helps anchor, things. So it's important, but underlying structure, that's what I'm trying to address here, that you have to go back to the beginning and understand policies that have been put in place. And when we use the word structural racism, it is not that individual level discrimination, it is these structures that create inequities. And so if we're going to address, all the underlying issues, we need to address the structure, because if you change the structure, then people don't have to worry about, their day-to-day experience, and you actually increase the chances of some of these issues being addressed. So I would agree that, the terminology doesn't really change much. It is really addressing those underlying structures.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. And not being a scholar, but certainly involved in work with underserved groups, language is important, and but it's only an entree into starting to reorganize your thinking about a concept. It isn't a solution if you don't change what's underneath. So I completely agree with you. Another comment from a researcher at BMC, Karen Lasser, she's a health services researcher and disparities researcher. She says, I find that the CDC guide, Health Equity Style Guide for COVID-19 Response, Principles and Preferred Terms for Non-Stigmatizing Bias-Free Language, very helpful. It suggests the term racial and ethnic minority groups rather than minorities.
So again, this is just what we just talked about terminology, right? So depending on who you talk to, and the disparities field is very, not everyone agrees with the CDC. For those who actually do this research, many of us do not agree with the CDC terminology. I personally do not believe that this is the right terminology. Some people believe that the BIPOC terminology is more inclusive. So I think the fundamental thing here is that if you bring a group of 10 scholars together, depending on their background, their perspective, they're going to come up with different language, different terminology. And we have to be sensitive to terminology. I agree with the idea of non-stigmatizing, but it's also the idea that you can't erase generations of action. You can't, by changing the terminology doesn't now mean all of a sudden people trust. So if I went to my community partners and I call them racial and ethnic minority groups, that doesn't change the fact that they don't trust the system. So I think we should be sensitive, but we also need to recognize that the terminology will change, and what it was 6 years ago, 5 years ago, what's going to be next year is going to keep changing.
I agree. Another question, another comment from John Polk was eugenics was research used to justify white supremacy. Just a comment.
Yep, that's again, this is where we as scholars, we need to actually own up to our contribution to the process. But like I said, we can't. We also need to recognize that there are scholars who actually debunked eugenics. So on both sides, and this is the beauty of academic medicine. You have one group who are doing research in one direction. You have other groups who are doing research in another direction. Eventually, truth prevails. And so the more we actually able to do these studies and show that these things are not true, we're able to actually change perspective and policies.
Another comment from Amanda Bologna-Smith. This is, I'm sorry, I cut ahead. I apologize. I will get to that question in a second. This is from Linda Sprague Martinez to everyone. Academic research institutions are steeped in white supremacy culture. The ways in which our institutions operate in communities is, I would say is oppressive, as is the assumption that knowledge generation can only happen in the academy. And then a further comment, this is an exceptional presentation.
Yeah, so I think just, again, I agree. And this is why we need to have these academic community partnerships. Because what we have found in our research is when we do listening sessions, we do a lot of focus groups, we do community engagement, it changes your question fundamentally. So we actually see our community partners as our allies. They are co-investigators on our studies. They're actually helping us shape the research. And then when we get results, we actually will ask them questions about how do we present this in a way that's meaningful. We do community report out. So I think the more we recognize that knowledge does not only sit in academia, that knowledge sits actually in the community. And that's kind of what I was talking about, the strength-based model. Then we actually recognize that communities have strengths. You can actually go to them. They can actually educate you as an investigator about things that actually make sense in your research.
I'm going to ask you a question for myself. And it's a practical question that has to do with a project that I'm currently involved in. Bottom line is I'm involved in the Healing Communities Study Project. And my role is to help with some of the informatics parts of the study. And one thing that the study is trying to do, they're doing it in a community engaged way. And there are people on the call that are actually better at describing this than I am, but I'll try and make my attempt. We have a lot of community coalitions involved, and they are creating information, data that is being collected centrally from the research project. One of the things that we want to do, though, is we want to feed that data back to the community so that they can use it. And one of the things that I've observed is that the community doesn't really know what to do with it. They don't really understand it completely, or perhaps it's just not in the same space of where they're at. Maybe it's the skills, or maybe it's training, or maybe it's just interest or distraction. I'm not sure what it is. But the researchers are tearing their hair out, trying to figure out, because there's this belief that if we give you data back from your community, that you'll use this and you'll help tell us what we should be doing, right? That's what we're supposed to do, community engaged wise. But we can't seem to get the data in a structure that people can actually use or can understand it. And so there's a lot of energy is going into that, but we're not getting anything out of it because we can't seem to meet the needs of the community. How do you go approaching that? So how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a common, when I do a lot of consulting, that's a common question people ask me. I think the starting point is, what I'm hearing you say is that you have ideas of what the community wants, and the community may not actually perceive that that's what they need. So part of the fundamental disconnect here is that if people are interested in something, they'll advocate for it. I mean, what we found in our community engaged work is if you talk to people and say, what do you really care about? Many times what they care about and what you care about may not align. And so what we try to do at the get-go is to actually have a clear understanding of what are your priorities. Sometimes the community priorities are things that as an investigator, I can't do. It's just not in my wheelhouse. I don't have the skill set. So what do? I actually bring in people who may actually be able to leverage that skill set, or I find a happy middle ground where we can actually agree on. And that discussion needs to be had before the grant is written. Because what happens is we get a grant funded, now we pull community members in. And many times, you know, a lot of community advisory boards, people say yes to you, you know, and they respond to what you want because, you know, they're on they don't want to offend you. But if you're really honest with them and say, look, what do you care about? I think people will tell you. So I would suggest that part of this is maybe bring a subgroup of individuals together and really take a step back and say, you know, what do you all care about this topic area? And then maybe have them ask questions about what do you want to use? How much of this do you really, what information do you need? And how do we help you frame it in a way that you actually would use it? So those are kind of things I'll think about.
Great. Thank you. There are several people that are part of the study who chimed in as well and gave very similar answers as well. And it boiled down to, you know, are you meeting the needs of the community and have you actually asked them? I could say just as part of the group that I'm working apart, people are tearing their hair out trying to do that and seem to be struggling with that. Let's see, what else? This is from Bill Adams. Thank you, Dr. E. Do you think we are at a point that there is enough examples of successful health equity advancement that we can expect research activities to be able to identify successful strategies / interventions, or is it still too early?
Very, very good question, Bill. So I think we actually have enough, you know, some of us actually argue that we've had enough data to work on interventions now for maybe 30 years. And you know, some people say, well, we don't have enough information. My perspective is that you need to do both. It's almost like a PDSA cycle. You have interventions you're doing, that where there's enough evidence for example, place-based initiatives has been funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, has been shown to be effective. Food access programs have been shown to have impact. You know, programs that focus on, if you look at in certain countries, basic income programs actually have been shown to have impact. So there are social programs that have been shown to be effective in other countries. And so but the challenge there is that we want one fix. The assumption that, you know, that magic bullet, there are no magic bullets. What we are going to be able to do is to say, okay, look, I'm going to take this slice of, I look at it from almost like a pizza, you know, take a slice of that pizza and I focus on it, I hone on it and I do my piece and I report on what I find. So I think there are probably about 5 broad areas right now where there appear to be interventions that are effective to address some of these upstream factors. And then people can then begin to test them. And as you test them, you find out that this is not working, you'll actually refine it. And just the willingness to go back and forth is what's going to help us go forward.
Great, thank you. Linda Sprague-Martinez just made a final comment based on the question I brought up, which was addressing the priorities of communities requires developing a relationship and investing time, which is what she told us about. When we rush through with a sense of urgency, it undermines the CE process. And I couldn't agree more with that. I think that part of what I just recounted to the group was in part the fact that there's this time crunch. And so there's just not enough time to allow people to kind of work through the process.
Yeah,
anyway.
And I think the other thing that's really important about Linda's point is that, you know, most funding agencies do not actually account for the time it takes to build these community relationships. And so part of what we should be asking, you know, so for example, you can't just walk in and do community engagement, you know, you get a 5-year grant and all of a sudden there's no time built in for community engagement. There needs to be some time built in where you actually have time to actually do that. Actually, you know, what we have been able to do is we've used foundation money and other resources to really build that network. We build the community network, then we get NIH to fund the actual science. So I think a part of this process is maybe also changing how NIH funds grants to actually build enough time. In my experience, it takes a minimum of 2 years to even get any kind of meaningful, because communities don't work the way we work. They don't just come to work every day and they sit down and they focus on this. They have other things that they're doing. So I think being able to be sensitive to that and maybe even building that explicitly into your budget and saying, I'm actually going to need time to do this before I actually get my study started. I think that may actually help change this culture and really take away the time crunch.
You know, we have to end because we're on a break, but I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll just give you one more anecdote, which is that I'm involved in another study. And it's a combination. I believe it's an R15, R33, or the numbers are not right, but it's a combination where the first 2 years are used for developing the intervention. And in this case, it's an electronic tool. And then the next 3 years, if that's successful, get funded to actually do the randomized control trial or whatever the study is down the line. Perhaps research in the equity space should have the same type of construct where you have a couple years to build coalition and to build a community engaged environment that you have some trustworthiness in, and then to go on and actually test the intervention that you developed with the individuals in the community.
Yeah.
So R34, somebody pointed out. So,
I think that's excellent. So PCORI does that right now, where they give you like a 18-month initial place to kind of develop your. They don't do it for community based, but really to help you feasibility phase, and then you do like a full scale study. I think that is going to be the model that someone actually mentioned it. I think that's going to be the model that we need to actually begin to adopt, even for NIH studies that try to health equity. Give you about 18 months, maybe 2 years to actually build that coalition, set up your processes, and then you go in and deliver your intervention, and that's going to be what makes it even more efficient.
Excellent. The questions keep rolling in, but I think people probably need a few minutes to run to the bathroom and to just, refresh themselves for the next speaker. So I'd like to close up by saying thank you so much for joining us and for giving such an excellent speech, and to really kind of elucidating some major concepts. I learned a lot from your talk as well. So thank you very much, and really appreciate your participation. So to the group, we're going to be taking a break now.